It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to another dialogue on development research, this time featuring Professor Melissa Leach as a speaker and Dr. Arunabha Ghosh as a discussant. These dialogues on development research are organized jointly by the Swedish Development Research Network, SweDev, and the Development Policy and Finance team at the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI. My name is Fredrik Söderbaum, and I'm a professor of Peace and Development Research in the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg, and I'm also a chair, or the chair of SweDev. Before I introduce the speakers, I will say a few words about SweDev and SEI. So the Swedish Development Research Network, SweDev, was formed in 2019, and we aim to strengthen collaboration between researchers and between researchers and practitioners in the field of development. These development dialogues is a joint activity between SweDev and SEI. And SweDev, we also organize or support a range of other seminars, workshops, and conferences. Please consult our website for more information and if you want to become a member of the network. So SweDev has two types of members. You are invited to become an individual member of the network. This is free, and you sign up on our online registry on the website. The second category of members are the institutional members that govern the network and design our work program. We invite Swedish university departments and research centers to become institutional members. Please consult our website for more information about how to join. We are a growing number of institutional members and several hundred individual members. SEI, Stockholm Environment Institute, is of course a world-famous research and policy institute engaged in the field of environment and development. Most of you are likely to know about it. Its headquarters is in Stockholm, but it also has 7 other offices around the world. These development dialogue series is managed by SEI's Development Policy and Finance team, which is led by Janet Vähämäki, who is also leading the SweDev Secretariat, which is hosted by SEI. Now, it's my privilege to introduce Professor Melissa Leach, who is a famous and leading authority on development research and development policy. She is the director of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and she has held a large number of official roles in both academia and external policy-related processes. Professor Leach has a background in social anthropology and geography, but over the last 3 decades she has built up an extremely broad and impressive portfolio of research and policy-related activities. Among many other things, she has led a wide range of interdisciplinary, collaborative, policy-engaged research programs, bringing local knowledge and perspectives into critical engagement with scientific as well as policy debates in fields such as global health, environment, sustainability, and development. Recently, she has been engaged in the major collaborative program on pandemic preparedness, local and global concepts and practices in tackling disease threats in Africa. I think this experience will feed into today's speech, which also draws on previous and much discussed articles in peer-reviewed journal. So today's speech is entitled Post-Pandemic Transformations and the Recasting of Development. Taking her point of departure in the COVID-19 pandemic and a series of other crises, Melissa Leach argues that the different crises provide the opportunity to recast mainstream development, which no longer works. Where mainstream approaches to development have often been top-down, rigid, and oriented towards narrowly defined goals, Leach argues that the recasted development represents a politics of hope, a hope for a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. Before I hand over to Melissa for her exciting speech, I want to introduce our discussant, Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who is an internationally recognized public policy expert, author, columnist, and institution builder. He holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford, and he previously worked at Princeton, Oxford, UNDP in New York, and WTO in Geneva. In 2010, Dr. Ghosh founded the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, which ranks as one of Asia's leading policy research institutions and among the world's 20 most influential climate think tanks. Dr. Ghosh has, for instance, been co-author of 3 UNDP Human Development Reports. Apart from leading this think tank, writing policy reports and being interviewed by media, Dr. Ghosh advises governments, industry, civil society and IOs around the world. And he is currently a member of a very large number of advisory committees. So now, before I hand over the word to Melissa, I can just inform how we have structured this event. Melissa will speak for around 30 minutes, give or take a few minutes. Then I invite Arunabha for his role as discussant for a maximum of 15 minutes. And after that we will have time for a Q&A session before I will wrap up and close the meeting, which should be no later than 2:15. So now, with these words, I invite Professor Leach. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fredrik, for your very generous introduction, and thank you to SEI for inviting me to this. What I'm going to be talking about draws on not just the work that I've been doing with partners around the world, but also some of the collaborative thinking that has been going on about IDS as we've all witnessed and worked through the pandemic and tried to reflect on what this means for recasting development in the future. So if I could have the next slide. Our context is one where the world is facing a whole range of global challenges. The point is that these are not alone and they intersect. Whether we're talking about climate and environmental change, conflict and displacement, all too obvious this week as we face the ongoing war in Gaza and the aftermath of the war in Ukraine, which is still continuing. Digital disruptions, pandemics and health crises connected too with inequalities themselves intersecting, and with forms of changing politics, where in many parts of the world we're seeing a re-rise of authoritarian politics and changing and often closing spaces for civil society. Now, some people are talking about this range of crises as a polycrisis. That was a term that was coined again by Adam Tooze in an article in the Financial Times not so long ago. And I think that sense of a polycrisis captures the ways in which these multiple crises don't just exist in parallel, but they interact in such a way that they amplify each other. But I also think that we must be careful with attributing polycrisis as something that's global and something that's new, because for many people in diverse parts of the world, they have actually been living ongoing intersecting challenges for a very long time. And I think, as I shall be arguing, there's a great deal we have to learn from them. So if I could have the next slide, please. At IDS, in this context of polycrisis, if we want to call it that, in the amplification of inequities and inequalities, we've been arguing that mainstream development, and I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that in a moment, really isn't working. We've got the amplification of inequities and problems, along with often the corporate control of many of the systems and agendas that we depend on. A decline and a fragmentation and a greater fragility of global cooperation and multilateralism. And amidst this, the voices of women and men in communities often not being heard. And this set of problems is why, in a broader initiative at IDS, we're suggesting that development needs to be recast if we want to move towards a world that is more equitable and more sustainable globally and locally, and to build what we're calling a politics of hope amidst crisis. So that's in a way the most general picture. If I could have the next slide. What I want to focus on is some work that a small group of us has been doing about what the COVID-19 pandemic actually tells us and opens up about the possibilities for recasting. Now, COVID-19 is in many respects the long-awaited big pandemic. Scientists, policymakers, people had been waiting for something like this to occur, and it did in 2020. And what unfolded was a health crisis, but it was also an economic and a social and a political crisis whose impacts intersected with each other. And the effects of COVID have also intersected with the effects of the climate crisis and with, in more recent times, the economic and political problems unleashed by conflict and war. So we've often then been talking about these 3 C's of COVID, climate and conflict. And what COVID amidst these other crises has revealed, we're suggesting, is a deeper crisis in development. So we've seen through the pandemic what might have been positive social, economic, political change rapidly undoing. We've seen that the origins of the pandemic and its effects revealing what I termed early in the pandemic as cracks in the systems that we all depend on. We've seen many of the development models that have long been dominant and that we've assumed kind of held really falling apart. Those models that emphasize economic growth, neoliberalization, globalization, and top-down planning, they've come under challenge in unprecedented ways. And crucially, this has been felt across the world, undermining long-held distinctions between North and South, developed and developing countries. So if I could have the next slide. What I want to argue now in the rest of this talk is that lessons from COVID, and indeed some of the earlier epidemics that it's built on, offer some quite important directions for the broader recasting of development that's now needed. This is not about building back better, which was one of the phrases used in the last couple of years about rebuilding post-COVID. It's about a deeper transformation in practices and policies and action, but also in ideas and knowledge. And there are sort of 4 or 5 areas I really want to highlight quite rapidly. The first is the need to reconceptualize development as universal or global. The second is about reworking our relationships with non-human natures. The third is about really focusing in on redressing inequalities and vulnerabilities. And the fourth is about rethinking economies, but I want to connect that up with putting resilience center stage amidst the uncertainties that COVID and other epidemics have revealed. So if I could have the next slide. Let's start straight in on these. So COVID as a health and development crisis and the inequalities, precarities it's exposed have been felt across the world, as much in New York as in Nairobi, as in many other places, although crucially in very different ways. This is not a common experience. What happened was very different in different places. But I think the point is that it happened everywhere and had impacts everywhere. and indeed has revealed it was often countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America whose experiences provided lessons that high-income countries could pick up on. So I've seen this as a real signal that the universality that many of us had been talking about for decades, actually. I mean, the origins of the Institute of Development Studies were in seeing Britain and Europe as a case for development, and not actually going with this idea that there are so-called developing countries. And of course, the UN Global Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, are universal. They apply to all countries across the world. And give us a way to overcome these really problematic, I think, distinctions that divide the world into developed and developing. So there's an opportunity, I think. Let's embrace it. Importantly, this is not to efface deep structural inequalities, which do sometimes play out along the lines of colonial legacies, or indeed of the global North and South in a political sense. But we do need to recognise they're more complicated geographies and politics, and that there are pockets of deep poverty, inequality, underdevelopment in even the richest and most apparently developed countries. So I think this opens the way too to strengthen a more decolonised agenda in development and development studies, which really takes seriously diverse and inclusive knowledges and resources, supported by a continuous awareness of and a challenging of these historically embedded power dynamics. So that's the kind of universal take overall. If I could have the next slide, though, it does beg the question of what am I talking about in development? And this has got one thinking. There are, in a way, the recasting that we're calling for is of what some scholars and practitioners have come to refer to as Big D development. That post-Second World War, post-Truman speech set of ideas, institutions and practices that go along with planned change, what we might call the aid industry or the development industry. And in 2001, Gillian Hart wrote, I think, a very, very helpful piece, which casts this as development with a big D. And other people like Cowan and Shenton, Emma Maudsley and others, geographers in particular, have continued to work with this idea of big D development as something we need to engage with, often quite critically. And they have distinguished it from small d development, which for this group is about capitalism. These are processes of capitalist change, recognizing that that in itself is uneven, it's often contradictory, and it's historically grounded. So there's big D and small d development. At the same time, in the last couple of decades, we've had a post-development movement, which has really said that there are problems with mainstream development. So let's look beyond development to the alternative visions, the actions, the priorities that emerge across what some are calling a pluriverse, a world of many worlds, where we can really foreground the alternatives that come particularly from smallholders, from Indigenous people, the social movements that they articulate. So this is Arturo Escobar, it's the contributors to Cotori et al.'s Post-Development Dictionary. And this is, they call this post-development. I would argue, and I think some of the IDS take, would be that post-development actually is development, because we can re-envisage development as positive change, good change for everybody everywhere. It's always normative, but it needs to be attentive to how particular people and societies, amidst their own historical and political experiences and their own aspirations, would define good change. That takes us back to the kinds of views that Robert Chambers has long pioneered and that colleagues and I pick up in our work around recasting. So recasting development, to me, is essentially about recasting and critically engaging with the big D in ways that recognise and allow space for development as good change in all those diverse ways of defining good to come to the fore. So let's look a little bit more at some of the elements of what a recast development as good change might look like. So This has, I think, to involve rethinking, reworking the relationships between humans and non-human natures. Now, I think anyone who works on climate change or water or natural resources or biodiversity would be amongst those the first to say that many of our ways of living with non-human natures are fundamentally broken. We've got an assault on non-human natures as never before. But this extends to and cross-cuts with questions around disease. And this is where reflecting on pandemics helps us. Because most new human diseases have been zoonoses. They come from animals and the viruses and pathogens that animals carry. They often spill over to people, either via their links with domesticated livestock and livestock systems, or from wildlife, through encroaching on habitats or through trade and markets. And sometimes one gets livestock and wildlife interacting in the kind of market setup that is seen to be, it was the origins of the SARS outbreak, avian flu, and indeed COVID, although there are still debates about how that happened. So if I could have the next slide, if we want to think about addressing and preventing future pandemics, we have to look at that human-animal interface. But it's not just what happens at the interface that's important. It's the broader structural drivers which shape those interfaces, and those are very much linked to dominant growth-oriented development models. So it's the ways markets work, it's the industrial food and livestock systems that create the conditions in which spillover happens. It's the population displacements which push people to encroach on wildlife habitats, often as a result of land and resource investments which displace people in remote areas, which are the bigger drivers which reshape these interfaces. And as prior to COVID, this report from the World Health Organization and the Convention on Biodiversity put it, the efficiencies, what we call the efficiencies of global trade, have often led to these landscapes and farming systems which are deeply impoverished. They don't have the firebreak of rich biodiversity. So instead, this pushes humans and viruses and pathogens and the animals that carry them into close proximity, creating the conditions for spillover. But in addition to this global picture, I think we have to be careful about assuming one-way connections. If I could have the next slide. What goes on locally is often quite complicated too. Take just one example. I've worked for much of my career in Sierra Leone where a rather nasty hemorrhagic fever is carried by the Lassa virus, which is transmitted to people from the Mastomys rodent. And rodents coexist with people. They live in these farm, savanna, forest ecologies. But if one wants to see how spillover of disease happens, you have to differentiate a bit more. You have to look at who's doing what in the landscape and who gets sick and why. And in this particular case, the point of greatest risk and vulnerability is for women gardeners who grow vegetables, very important for household income and independent income, in precisely the dry season swamp areas where we find most Mastomys rodents hanging out in the dry season. And it's not surprising then that we find both more Mastomys rodents and in those swamps and more women catching Lassa fever in the dry season as a result of that connection. Now, the answer is absolutely not either to stop gardening or somehow to cull all rodents, which would be impossible anyway because they coexist with people's lives. But there are, as our project began to look at, ways of balancing disease risk with the importance of gardening through integrating crop protection with disease control and involving women gardeners in solutions which adjust their labour and their priorities to minimise risk. So if I could have the next slide. What this means really is engaging with political ecologies. Addressing conditions of disease emergence is crucial, and there's a lot of debate now about pandemic prevention, but we have to be careful about simple one-way narratives that just go, it's environmental degradation, people encroaching on wildlife, because those often just address the symptoms. They blame farmers, they blame wildlife traders, they end up closing off farming systems or territorial markets and ways that actually do in the livelihoods of those market traders or those farmers. So we need to be looking to understand and engage with these more complex dynamics in a more nuanced way, taking a more respectful approach which engages and works with people who already live with and care for nature, while also addressing these bigger structural conditions and drivers which often push people into these more problematic interactions. And I think there are lessons there for pandemic preparedness and prevention, but also as a style of work for addressing other environmental and climate-related issues too. So if I could have the next slide. And my second theme is about inequality and vulnerability. Now, epidemics are always mirrors to society, and they tend to spread in conditions of inequality and what Paul Farmer called structural violence, I think a term that is very helpful. COVID, this was the case for Ebola, for HIV, for other epidemics like the Zika virus, and it was the case for COVID, which has revealed a really unequal world, a world of historically related marginalization and structural vulnerabilities. And this manifested during the pandemic in a number of different ways. We saw inequalities and vulnerability to the disease itself as its effects of the COVID virus related to people's comorbidities, the other diseases they faced, the racialized, the class occupations that increased exposure. We also saw inequalities in people's abilities to stay safe. The virus spread fast in crowded low-income settlements and amongst people with precarious livelihoods who often couldn't follow the rules about protecting oneself. They didn't have the water, they didn't have the ability to isolate. We also saw deeply unequal access to health resources. The scandal of global vaccine inequities as rich countries hoarded vaccines at the expense of poor countries was a more immediate effect. But what was also exposed was inequalities in health systems going back over a very, very long way. And then we also saw public health measures, and particularly heavy-handed lockdowns, which often reinforced precarities and reinforced the marginalization, especially of informal traders, informal workers, refugees, mobile pastoralists. So if I could have the next slide, I think what we saw through COVID was not just multidimensional effects of a disease on inequality, but also the importance of inequalities themselves being multidimensional, something we highlighted a few years ago in the World Social Science Report, where inequalities are not just economic, they're also social, they're political, they're spatial, they're cultural. They intersect with each other. And to follow Nancy Fraser's schema, some of those inequalities are recognitional. They're about, do you actually take account of the people, the positions, the interests of certain groups? In this case, do mobile pastoralists get a look in? Do informal workers get a look in? There are then procedural inequalities about how different groups have the opportunity to be part of policy-making processes, decision-making processes. And then that in turn has distributional effects. Who gets sick and why? How do the other impacts of a disease unfold? And I think we saw all of those at play in COVID. So if I could have the next slide. I think it means that redressing inequalities itself is vital. Again, as we argued in the World Social Science Report, inequality is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's Goal 10. But it interacts with many, many other goals, not just those around health, as I've been talking about, but also those around environment, around poverty, around gender, and around conflict. So moving swiftly on, we can turn then to thinking about economies. And the COVID pandemic, like the other crises it's interacted with, I think have revealed in a very powerful way how fragile and frankly inadequate are the dominant economic models that have been part and parcel of mainstream development. The economic impact of COVID took countries in the world by surprise. Huge estimates, I think, still unfolding now about the costs of the pandemic itself, as well as other impacts. It revealed the fragility of the global model where economies and GDP are dependent on long supply chains, financialized transactions in so many areas of life. Some, of course, have benefited from the business and investment opportunities of a fragile and globalized and interdependent world, which then face crisis. I think something we saw very clearly as the tail end of COVID interacted with the Ukraine war and caused major problems in our food system and in energy systems. And yet, energy companies and grain trading companies made windfall profits. Meanwhile, others faced enormous precarity, particularly of work and of livelihoods, often in some cases mitigated by social protection and social safety nets, which have put in place abilities to cope, but with very varied state capacities to fund and implement those. So if I could have the next slide. What then are some of the routes to economies that are going to be more inclusive and more resilient? Now, as always, when one has a crisis, many started to talk post-COVID about big fiscal stimulus packages that can enable us to return to a status quo. But this is a status quo with a still problematic high carbon economy and one that you measure in terms of growth and of GDP. I think the pandemic and these intersecting crises give us an opportunity to think differently and more radically, to look to what we can learn from some of the local solidarity initiatives which emerged through COVID. These were often self-help and neighbourhood networks which filled gaps in people's need for food and money and livelihood resources. In some ways, they were about coping in difficult situations, but they also exemplify, I think, future possibilities, which place more emphasis on supporting informal economic activity, on supporting shared resources and collective management of resources, and principles of collaborative, regenerative, circular economies, which lead us to rethink value and purpose more broadly. And I think to pick up on the really important debates in the context of climate and environmental disaster, as well as pandemic disasters, about what are economies for? What are value and purpose all about? And if we're to put at centre stage well-being and resilience, then perhaps we should be more agnostic about whether growth is actually a route to get there. Certainly, we need to think much harder about the directions in which growth and any investment are moving. COVID, I think, also showed us that it wasn't just a question of what markets are doing. Certainly, markets can't do everything, but nor is it just about states. We saw some very good examples of what Mariana Mazzucato talks about when she pitches the idea of an entrepreneurial state, which helps to set directions for investment and innovation, to crowd in by public investments, which are sometimes offsetting risks, and can crowd in then private companies to move in positive ways. Something we saw, for instance, with vaccine development, and where I think there are opportunities too in climate and environmental finance. So I think we've got a more open door. not just to move back to trying to build back better, but actually to think more transformatively about what kinds of economies we need. So if I could have the next slide. If one of the needs is for resilient economies and societies, then we can also, I think, look to what communities taught us through the COVID pandemic, because we did see across the world some remarkable citizen-led and community-based responses at times when governments and states often were failing. Responses to disease, but also to the impacts of public health measures and lockdown, where we had neighbourhood networks, community groups, diaspora networks, sometimes religious organisations, diverse forms of public authority, finding routes for people to be able to manage. But I think one of the other key lessons was that responses were most effective where this kind of bottom-up action was supported by states, often by local government, but also by the resources that public investment could provide. Bangladesh, I think, provided a fantastic example of what happened through COVID in this way, both directly drawing on the experience of connecting civil society with local government and national government, which in a way had been tried and tested through responses to climate change emergency and to climate adaptation. And I think what Bangladesh's COVID response showed us was both a direct drawing on those climate-related skills and capacities, but also a lesson for how these things could work into the future. So communities cannot do it all. They need to be supported by effective and accountable states. And I think here we've got some learning again from the COVID pandemic for what one might talk about as inclusive resilience in development more broadly. So if I could have the next slide. Resilience is partly important in the face of uncertainty. And disease outbreaks and pandemics are an example par excellence of an uncertain world. When disease outbreaks occur, the reflex action from policymakers is often to close down, try and mitigate risk and control or manage them. But that is not very often an effective way to proceed when you've got ongoing uncertainties and unpredictabilities. And I think what COVID showed us was that there's actually a need to work in a way that's more adaptable and more flexible, learning by doing, and that needs to be informed by multiple knowledges. It's not just about natural science or biomedical science telling us about disease, but about illuminating complex problems and then drawing on everyday expertise to be able to navigate them, with much to learn from people who have long lived with uncertainty every day. The project I've just been involved in about navigating disease threats in African contexts, which tracked how people in villages where they'd lived over decades with a whole range of livelihood and environmental and economic and political, as well as health-related uncertainties, actually mobilized those forms of knowledge and those capacities to get through COVID. It's also an area of learning that my colleague Ian Scoons has been working on in a project on pastoralism and resilience. And we've generated a whole set of comic strips which show what the world can learn from pastoralists amongst some of the most marginalized people in the world in terms of project, program and policy styles that emphasize learning, adaptation and flexible action. This picture on the right is just one of the comic strips, the one that focused on pandemics, but there are many others. So if I could have the next slide. Now moving towards what we take from all of this by conclusion. What I think we're suggesting is that the time is ripe for a recasting of development which is around a radically transformative and more egalitarian and inclusive knowledge and politics. Recasting is also a way of looking forward. It's not just about remoulding the way that development has been done in the past, that sense of recasting, to follow the metaphor of perhaps a sculptor who remolds their piece and their sculpture, recasting it through a kiln so it comes out in a different shape. It's also taking the metaphor of recasting in a different way. Take the metaphor of a fisher person, for instance, who casts their line across the water and recasts forward to look to the future in a different way. And I think this is where we can connect up with the idea of hope and being forward-looking. And I think this does involve some of the things I've talked about. It's a re-envisaged way of connecting with humanity and nature. It's about challenging inequalities and especially their structural underpinnings. It's about fostering inclusive economies, which build on what we can learn from people who are already building their economies in those ways, while also challenging quite explicitly the capitalist and financial relations which are pushing us in different directions. And it's about reorientating around resilience amidst uncertainties. And this is, to come back to that first argument, relevant to everyone everywhere, to all settings across the world, although in different ways. Universal development, global development, doesn't mean assuming everybody's the same. It absolutely doesn't mean taking away and not recognizing those fundamental structural differences, but it does mean reflecting and working in a way that sees development challenges as something that happens in the UK where I live, round the corner in Brighton, round the corner in Sweden, wherever we are, as well as in places that might seem far away but are perhaps closer to home than we realise. So if I could have my next and final slide, I think we can think further and perhaps could pick up in discussion on what this means practically. Some of the key principles. It's about building capacities to anticipate and respond to shocks, building capacities to both reveal and challenge power. It's about capacities to support flexible and negotiated responses in the face of uncertainty. It's about capacities to engage with power and politics, to recognize that development is always about power. And we do need to challenge the mainstream, those big Ds, those capital Ds, at the same time as fostering those hopeful alternatives, in a way bringing the small Ds universal, around approaches that are perhaps more caring. And I see care increasingly as a watchword for the kind of small d development that we need. And this, I think, also translates into an inclusive politics of knowledge in research and in development studies, which is more decolonial and was trying to work through genuinely equitable partnerships. So my final slide really just states that if we don't take the opportunity, this post-COVID or polycrisis moment, to reach for this kind of more transformative and fundamental change, development with a big D, and indeed a small d, will have failed. And I think we can expect that future shocks and unfolding crises will wreak even greater havoc. So let's look to a politics of hope and a more transformative way of thinking and practicing development and development studies. So thank you very much, and I very much look forward to discussing.
Thank you. This was an amazing speech. And it covered, I mean, everything from global structure down to local developments and local perspectives, and from health, environment, resilience, and all of it. So I'm very inspired, and Without further ado, I just hand over the word to Arunabha Ghosh. Please, the floor is yours. Maximum 15 minutes, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredrik, and thank you, Melissa, for that extraordinary presentation. As Fredrik was mentioning, it covers a huge range. And for me to respond in just 15 minutes is, I think, the 10th planetary boundary that I have to avoid breaching. But I will do my best. I think my first point would be that I don't disagree at all with the broad thesis that you've put forward that we do need a recasting of development. But if I had to take a step back, I would see, or I would sort of evaluate the thesis you've presented on a spectrum ranging from diagnosis to prescription. And if I might hazard a first reaction, that it is, as presented, more about diagnosis and a little bit about prescription, not because you've not outlined what needs to change, but I think we have to, in our dialogue and beyond, think about how that change might come about. So I ask myself this question, what is the diagnosis missing? And I think one of the things that jumps out to me is, while we've outlined the failures that we are seeing in the current paradigm of development, and let's take development for my commentary as the broader sustainable development agenda, is the failure endemic or is the failure exogenous, right? In the sense that we all know we are not meeting our metrics of sustainable development, but is that because of the manner in which we've cast development? I think the answer is yes, as you've described it. But I think it is also in part on the manner in which exogenous factors, including geopolitics and the structural sort of convulsions that global politics are going through, are also impacting in the way of the boundaries within which a recasting of development can be framed. And therefore, I then ask, if we come to the prescription, who is asking for the change? And I'm being intentionally provocative because, of course, Melissa Leach is presenting the ideal change that we would like, but who is asking for it? Because there is a difference between you and me and others who are enduring the status quo versus those who are asking for the change versus those who might be able to lead the change. And I would hazard that the number of people or the number of constituencies at the further end of that spectrum will be fewer than upstream. So the diagnosis requires that bifurcation between the endemic versus the exogenous factors, and the prescription requires an unpacking of the politics of how do we get to these new paradigms that you're suggesting by leveraging new constituencies that might be voiceless right now. So having said that, in my remainder 10 or 11 minutes, I do want to therefore reflect a little bit on these specific themes that you've outlined, Melissa. Let's start with this issue of recasting development as universal. And I want to just suggest that one of the reasons why that recasting is required is because the nature of global development itself has changed. That big D that you refer to is actually an offspring of post-Second World War casting of development. Now, that casting of development for some parts of the world was a casting of development as reconstruction. That's why we got the World Bank called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Yeah.
And I would argue that now increasingly we need less reconstruction and more resilience, as you have also pointed out later in your presentation. Another way in which development was cast was catch-up. Basically, latecomers to development, post-colonial societies, etc., if they did all the right things, could eventually catch up with the growth rates and then the growth and the development levels. I think now it's not just about catch up, but also about constraints. What is the constraint within which we are trying to catch up? The notion of planetary boundaries didn't exist. And the third way in which development is being recast is that there was this notion around cooperation. We cooperate on international trade. We cooperate on international investment. And of course, there were winners and losers, but net, if there was, net gains, it was a good thing. I think that transactional approach is not sufficient anymore, because we also have to look at development cost as coordination. What are the issues around which we need to act together, not just with each other, but against something external that is hitting us, for instance, a pandemic? So this reframing of how development was conceived in 1945 versus how development might be conceived in 2025, when the UN, for instance, has its 80th anniversary, is to first recognize that it is also about resilience, it's also about constraints, and it's also about coordination, not just about reconstruction, catch-up, and cooperation. The other thing that will determine how this will unfold is what you've rightly called this kind of sometimes accurate, sometimes legitimate, but sometimes insufficient bifurcation between developed and developing countries. It's accurate when you look at numerical metrics. It's legitimate when you look at historical responsibilities, but it's insufficient when we think of how global governance itself is evolving. I would argue that in global governance, pick an issue area, we're going through 4 transitions, from developing countries being rule takers to at least trying to be rule shapers, from us trying to design rules within individual regimes to designing new regimes altogether, from dealing with individual issue areas through individual regimes to what in the literature is called regime complexes, and through a paradigm that originated as intergovernmental negotiations into a much more network governance of various stakeholders. Now, once we start understanding the elements of how development is being recast and these transitions that are occurring in global governance, it then gives us some insight into how that politics of the prescription might unfold when we look at your sort of pillars of prescriptions that you outline. So let's take the non-human natures prescription. Again, no argument at all. In fact, last year, when my organization, CEW, and the Stockholm Environment Institute published the scientific report for the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, this was also very much something that we identified, the need to have the economy embedded within society and society embedded within the biosphere, and to then recast the relationship between humans and non-human natures. But in order to do that, we have to look at what are the arenas within which this will actually occur. Human society is now primarily urbanized. So how do we reframe or recast these changes in global governance and these norms that you're suggesting within our cities and our urban areas? What will be that bottom-up politics that then recast development at a global scale? How do we think about non-human natures if we don't think about industrial agriculture or animal welfare, etc., framed within sustainable development governance? How do we engage with non-human nature if our education systems have not changed at all? And how do we, and you draw attention to this, draw on alternative ways of understanding our relationship with non-human nature if we are not actively tapping into bodies of indigenous knowledge? So I think these are sort of routes through which some of this can be operationalized. Another area that you very clearly highlighted, and you're absolutely right, is this notion around inequalities and vulnerabilities. But I want to just understand this or put this out there for the listeners as well. You're right in describing inequality not just as economic. It is structural, it is political, it is social. But again, to operationalize the equity that we all seek, how do we do it? And I want to simply propose that we've got to, again, go from the transactional nature of economic relationship to the coordinated nature of what do you co-create and co-develop, especially when it comes to the technologies of the future. Beyond just co-creating something, how do we genuinely consult with each other? Public consultations are not just a unidirectional flow of information, but a bidirectional conversation and a discourse that is missing often. And how do we go from consultative to completely disruptive new paradigms? You mentioned agriculture, for instance. So how do we go from sustainable agricultural practices in pockets to sustainable agricultural systems that are then co-created? These are then ways, again, to operationalize the equity that we seek. I know I have just 4 minutes left. So two other things that you brought up: the nature of our economies and the nature of resilience. And I just wanted to offer some thoughts. I think one of the first things we got to do in recasting how we think about economic development, including that whole challenge between convergence and constraint, is focus on lifestyle. And we've still not thought about development as what it means for the individual to align themselves within boundaries rather than just economies overall within planetary boundaries. And their individual story only unfolds in terms of what is the lifestyle we are pursuing. So if we are co-developing new technologies, it's great. But if we are co-developing new technology to drive new cars, that's not the same as co-developing technologies to ride buses, which is not the same as co-developing and co-designing cities where we can walk or cycle, right? So it's a completely different approach towards lifestyle, which we have to first hold that mirror to ourselves and ask ourselves, what is the nudging of behavior that is necessary? But what is also the enabling of markets that responds to that nudged behavior, that call for a circular economy, that call for sustainable consumption? Otherwise, it is only a cause for frustration. And similarly, when it comes to jobs that are embedded in our economies, I think we have to stop thinking about economies as designed as we will design, whether through the state or the market, the sectors within which jobs will then get created, to rethinking how development itself occurs by understanding that the future is not only necessary to be decarbonized, but also enabled by the fact that it will be digitalized and therefore can be a lot more decentralized. So you're not giving jobs, but you're enabling entrepreneurship and micro-entrepreneurship that responds to this recast development. And therefore, that finally brings me to the issue of resilience. No argument at all that we have to navigate uncertainty. But my crude, unscientific definition of resilience is how quickly can we bounce back? And in order to do that, we have to do two things very consciously. First, understand, not just navigate uncertainty, but understand vulnerability. And we don't understand vulnerability because we don't assess vulnerability at a hyper-local level. Climate risk, for instance, no developing country in the world has a detailed hyper-local climate risk atlas. So how do you navigate that uncertainty without understanding how it's going to impact not just your city, but your neighborhood? And the other thing that we have not consciously done is bridge that state versus community resilience into a state and community resilience. Therefore, I want to then close my comment in the last minute I have, going back to that whole nature of what will operationalize the politics in the context of not just the endemic and endogenous challenges, but the geopolitical and exogenous challenges that we face. I think we have to, in addition to recasting development and in understanding the changes in global governance, we have to recast multilateralism and global cooperation. from an all-encompassing everything, we all trade and invest with each other, but some of us win and some of us lose, but net, it's all great, to at least a de minimis multilateralism, where we engage not on dilemmas of common interests, but on dilemmas of common aversions. What is it that we all have an interest in avoiding and combating? A pandemic, an extreme weather event, maybe even an asteroid hitting the planet. So once we understand what is changing with it, which is within our control, and what is changing which is not within our control, maybe we find that convergence, maybe that sliver of hope in your politics of hope that gives us that de minimis multilateralism at a global level, but also a much more resilient, coordinated, community-centric approach towards building resilience, but also driving a very different nature of economic development.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for a very insightful commentary and questions and reflections. We initially thought about jumping straight to the questions from the audience, but Melissa, don't you want to respond for a few minutes, and then we get back to the questions and from the audience, please.
I would love to. First, I have to say thank you. That was just a brilliant set of comments, and essentially, I mean, I skated very fast over a vast number of areas, and you have rightly called out some extremely important issues and questions, some of which I thought about, some of which I think you've put in an extremely pithy and valuable way. So if I can run just very quickly through the sort of universal, well, first of all, I mean, this question about how much is diagnosis and how much is as it were operationalizing a recasting. And I would completely agree with you that where we need to go is around the operationalizing and recasting, but that in turn requires some reflection, I think, on who is responsible. And your comments have quite rightly pointed to the necessary new ways in which community organizations and local perspectives might interact with a global world that has been driving mainstream development to date in different ways. And I think that's part of it. So I would slightly come back on your question about what's endemic and what's exogenous by saying that's part of the problem. And we actually need to recast somewhat how we define those things. You suggested, I think, very helpfully that much of the sort of post-war Big D development has been focused around reconstruction, catch-up, cooperation, and in a sense agreed with my sense that resilience needs to be center stage. I would agree that restraint is part of this and that coordination now goes away from cooperation. But we also need to think about this in political terms. I mean, I think the norms around cooperation were constructed in a very apolitical way and have been lived in that way. We're now in a world where we've got geopolitical polarities, we've got the rise of China, we've got the new polarities around the BRICS, around the discussions as more countries join up with those so-called South-South modes of cooperation, but are at the same time putting forward very different political agendas. And I think the current conflict that's playing out in the Middle East at the moment is also a broader geopolitical conflict, which is pitching some very different perspectives from the US and some European allies from the rest of the world. So this is fundamentally political, and I don't think we can move from cooperation to coordination without taking those politics seriously. I would also add into the mix, if we're to think about justice, there's another word, which is reparation. And the discussions around a more decolonized approach to development, as indeed about pandemics and about climate change, are now looking to justice, not just as distributional, but also as reparative. The climate financing around loss and damage are taking us in that direction, and some of the broader ideas about just transitions in sustainable development are not just about compensating workers who will lose out from taking certain actions around sustainability in nature, but are also about dealing with the reparations from where they've lost earlier. So I would agree with your forward-looking points there, but add to them a little bit. The questions about human, non-human natures, I mean, completely agree with you. I was also part of the SEI discussions around the SEI report, which absolutely looked at reworking our human, non-human nature relationships. And I couldn't agree with you more. This is what I spend much more of my time working on and thinking about in relation to biodiversity and forests and soils and rural worlds, but also urban worlds. And my sense is that we can get a lot further by recognizing the connectivities that already exist amongst people and the non-human, plants and animals and fungi and microorganisms, and the connected ways of living and being that actually are in urban areas as well as rural ones. I mean, what we're learning about urban biodiversity or about the importance of encounters with non-human nature for well-being and livelihoods in cities as much as in rural areas are things we can build on. That is about Indigenous knowledge. It's also very much about people rescuing aspects of their own everyday experience and bringing those to the fore, which in turn relates to education. As you've said, we need forms of education which are not just driven by mainstream scientific paradigms, but are actually also recognizing everyday experience and building on those. This takes one to inequalities. I mean, huge area, but operationalizing approaches which are tackling inequalities absolutely need to address systems and structures. They are partly about co-creating with communities, with those at the sharp end of inequality, but they're also about addressing the systemic factors which mean those approaches actually get a way forward. So in relation to food, I've been working a lot with the independent panel of experts on sustainable food systems, where we're partly looking at how you can support agroecology and ways of and the principles around living with nature and food sovereignty and greater equity for local food systems. But that in turn means tackling the governance of food systems at the highest levels and the economic incentives, which often allow corporate controlled industrial farming with all its built-in unsustainabilities and inequitabilities to thrive. So these are about global and local. I would take that through to comments about economy as well, which I very much agree with you. Much more to say about the opportunities of digitalized forms of work into the future. And then finally on resilience, yes, a mainstream way of thinking about resilience, I mean, in fact, the sort of dominant way is about bouncing back. But I'm taken with those who've also been talking about transformative resilience, which does attempt to build forward differently, recognizing those structures which have created and contributed to vulnerabilities, and that co-create ways forward with people who are vulnerable and with ways of tackling those structural vulnerabilities. People like Chris Bennett and others, and this whole stream of work on transformative resilience, I think offers us ways forward there, which are not just about bouncing back. And finally, I think I would just agree with you that this is very much about working across scales, about, yes, working with local movements and understandings from below, but they're not going to get very far unless we match them up with some really serious questions about reworking forms of global governance and a multilateral system, which is frankly failing everybody and everything in terms of creating unified global ways forward around the challenges and the limits that are facing us all. So it wasn't something I could talk about here, but it's a really huge agenda that I think we all need to tackle.
Thank you very much for an exciting discussion. Now we have some minutes left for the Q&A, and I will pick and give you 3 questions to Melissa from the audience, and I will formulate them, and hopefully you can reply to them in one go. So the first question is from Maike. What does recasting development mean for development aid and where the money goes? What are the financial models for supporting small d development in equitable ways? That's number 1. Number 2 is, how do we foster and navigate policies of hope in a context with increasing populist movements and resistance to sustainable transformations? There was another question also speaking about the resistance to transformation, even from within civil society. So ruling elites, political and economic elites, and even within civil society may resist change. The last question we pick here. Thank you from the audience for all the questions. We have to be selective here, and one question was from Desmond McNeil. Thank you for an excellent lecture. Could you say a little bit more about the role of the private sector, and more especially public-private partnerships, villains or heroes, most recently in the context of the COVID? So these are the questions that we pick now, and give you a few minutes before I can round up.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I mean, really good questions. So the first about models of aid. I think sort of in a way, the bigger question is to say, what is aid for? So what are the directions that development is moving in? And who gets to define those agendas? So in a sense, that's the bigger recasting agenda that I'm thinking about. And so not necessarily having economic growth and GDP, and I mean, so what is actually aid trying to do? Okay, so if one then takes an argument that aid should be trying to support some of the things I've been talking about, forms of development that are about resilience, about well-being, or about inclusivity, about tackling equity and vulnerabilities and strengthening the systems that can support those, then I think one can ask some questions about the modalities that will enable that. So I think there are a few there. One is about localization. And genuinely taking forward a model of aid spend where directions and spend are determined by countries, but also by local settings within those countries. So it's local government, it's civil society being part of the co-creation of the spending agendas on the ground. I think the second is about flexibility. And having forms of aid which are not following planning blueprints, but can enable some learning by doing along the way. All project and programs, which are still the main modality of aid, throw up unintended consequences. They throw up surprises. And I think you very much need modes of spend which can respond to those unintended consequences and redirect as one goes. So I think those would be my two about aid modalities. The whole question of resistance, whether it's coming from political economic elites whose interests, frankly, are challenged because they've done very well out of models of development and change which are essentially capitalist and which are shoring up inequalities. This is the 1% who have been who have been benefiting from the processes which have also produced inequalities and unsustainabilities. So we've got one set of resistances there simply from political and economic interests. And then I think related to those, we've got the trends towards anti-democratization and more authoritarian populist governments who are often supporting those political economic elites, but through styles of government that are frankly quite anti-democratic. And this creates enormous problems. Resistance is afoot. Resistance is happening through social movements, through digital media, through a proliferation of citizen and kickbacks across the world, but those resistances are often being closed down. So there's a backlash against resistance as well. I think there's no substitute for continuing to foster resistance and for recognizing that we are talking here about difficult politics. And this is going to involve some kinds of political movements that are not just about neat convergence of interest and collaboration and co-design. Sometimes they're going to become more antagonistic. And I think there's no substitute for recognizing that. We've recently we've got a big project at IDS around how all of this is playing out in the field of gender and the backlash against women's economic empowerment that we see happening across the world. And I think that's just one area where this is live and well. So finally, Desmond, lovely to have you online. Are PPPs part of the problem or part of the solution? I think, of course, they can be both, and I would say that, wouldn't I? I think very often they become part of the problem because we have agendas set that are sort of linking up private finance and state action in ways that are pursuing a status quo. We see this in the food area, which I know you've worked on and I work on. We saw this also around COVID, but COVID also saw us, I think, showed some of the possibilities of public-private partnerships actually working rather differently. So the development of vaccines, I think, was a very good example initially of public-private partnerships working in a positive way, but then we saw them closing down so that they fostered and played into vaccine hoarding by the global north and against some low-income countries. So now I think we need to think about public-private partnerships very much supporting local and national manufacturing capacity in other countries as well. So PPPs are a mechanism. They're a mechanism that shouldn't, as it were, be driving the show. They should be coming in to deliver and implement when the directions have been actually set by agendas that are more about citizens and democratic states and accountabilities.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. This has been an exciting seminar and discussion, and big thanks especially to Melissa and Arunabha. Also thanks to the audience for interacting and listening. On behalf of SEI and SweDev, I just want to thank you all for participating, and we soon close this. I just want to mention a few things. As Carly has written in the chat, feel free to join SweDev, sign up in the registry or sign up for the newsletter. There are web links in the chat function. Also, there is a link to a small short survey about the webinar. Please fill it in to give feedback to the organizers, so how to fine-tune these seminars. And finally, keep your eyes open for forthcoming dialogues such as this. There are no dates defined yet for the forthcoming ones, but there will be more seminars in the spring. So just stay tuned. And with these words, I close this successful seminar.